Lysara had learned early how a room could hold a verdict. The council chamber smelled of smoked pine and old ink and the colder metallic tang of coin. Light slanted in through narrow windows and lay across benches like fingers, pointing and counting. She sat on a wooden stool too small for her, her fingers bruised purple where the rope had pressed into her wrists that morning, and felt the weight of every gaze as an accusation before the first words were spoken. She had been brought here not as an accused, but as an offering, a wolfless, a female shifter who carried no litter, no pack blood. In the valley that breed determined status like weather, and Lysara had always been a winter that would not thaw. Her family had given her, no, not given, abandoned her in sacrificial hope. Her mother had said doing so might buy the family a season of food, of coal for the furnace. Lysara had said nothing. She had learned that silence could be its own rebellion. The man at the head of the chamber sat like a mountain that had been taught to move politely. He wore sable and iron, the coat trimmed with runes stitched in older thread, and his presence rearranged the room's air. No one dared cough. Lysara smelled him before she saw him clearly, a fierce odor like sun-baked leather, jasmine that had been charred, and beneath everything a metallic bite she could not name. "Bring her forward," the man said, and the voice that carried was low, with an architecture of command. Heads turned as if pulled by an invisible string. She stepped forward on hollow legs and felt the world tilt. Her whole life had compressed into the simple fact of being here in front of him. He did not rise. He inspected her as one might inspect a valuable but potentially dangerous artifact. Lysara's heart hammered in her throat. Each beat felt loud enough to warrant reproach. "So, this is the wolfless?" he said finally. "You know what she is," said a voice to her left. Forvik, the magistrate who had overseen the proceedings, thin-voiced and fussy as a crow. "This one offers no bond, no blood. She is of no pack. She is a commodity." A woman in the gallery finished softly, and somewhere a child began to snuffle. The room had a flavor of pity and triumph mixed together, like broth that was thin and proud. Lysara kept her chin level. Humiliation had been a daily ration for her. She could measure it now by the way her hands trembled. But the tremor did not show on her face. That was reserve earned by necessity. "If I am a commodity," she said, voice small, "I am not for sale." A murmur rolled through the audience. Someone laughed a string of harsh little noises. The man smiled then, an expression that made the room colder. "You speak too boldly for one unbound," he said. "Do you know who I am?" Lysara had known the name since childhood. The thinking, it was less a name than a verdict in the valley. He was referred to in the same breath as kings and curses. Caloran, warden of the highlands. Rumors called him a demon in human architecture and a king in teeth and muscle. His power radiated. It pressed against her skin like the beginnings of a storm. "I know you," she answered simply. "I know your reach." He had expected fear. He received instead the quiet of someone who had lived long with being unseen. Curiosity shimmered across his face then, like heat over stone. It was the first fissure she'd seen in his armor. "Very well," Caloran said. "You will come with me. You will take the path of those the valley discards." They took her to his keep that afternoon, and the world of rumor yielded to the world of detail. The keep sat carved into the side of a cliff, windows like slit eyes watching like guardians. When the stables opened to admit her, the smell changed. Moss, iron, the strong leather of saddles. His guards were everywhere, broad-shouldered, with the stoic faces of men who had swallowed storms and not been broken by them. They watched her like prey, but they moved around his presence with respect that bordered on worship. Cailorin walked beside her, not ahead. The proximity of his body was a pressure, an authority. When they crossed into the inner courtyard, she felt a pull, an irrelevant, irrational tug, the way a magnet responds to hidden metal. Her stomach clenched. She shook her head minutely as if to dislodge invisible strings. "You will be housed," he said, voice even. "You will be fed. You will work where you may. You will not leave without my leave." She kept looking at him, at the way the sun caught his profile and threw half his face into a carved shadow. Something unsaid lay there, sealed with an economy of expression. "And if I refuse?" Lysara asked. He cocked his head as if entertained by her audacity. "Then you will discover the point of a monster's patience." She imagined, in the flicker between heartbeat and breath, the monster he meant. The valley's imagination had breathed that beast into the world with 1,000 whisperings. But Cailorin's monster had a face like a man's face, not like a myth's. There was a loneliness in it she felt like frostbite. It burned her oddly. She had been alone long enough that she knew courage was not always the flash of action. Sometimes courage was a measured breath held until the body stopped shaking. "I will not be your pet," she said. "Nobody asked you to be." He replied. There was a quality to his voice now that was not cruelty, but a study. "You will be useful?" Confinement took many shapes inside the keep. They gave her a small room with a single narrow window that opened onto the cliff's edge. On good evenings, she could see the valley below, the patterns of smoke like rivers rising from hearths. On the worst mornings, wind pressed itself through cracks to taunt her. The bed was coarse-stuffed and smelled faintly of lavender. He had had someone choose lavender for the wolfless, which was either a mercy or a farce. She moved through days like a ghost with purpose. They made her polish armor that never gleamed to her satisfaction, mend cloaks no one had bothered to repair, and braid the manes of beasts she had never tamed. They watched her hands for any tremor and praised them for steadiness. Her unique skill, if it could be called that, was not immediately prized. She was not a fighter, not a breeder, not a seamstress of renown. She told stories. Stories had always been her coin in small barter. In a world that valued bite and blood, her stories were strange currency. Small magics that could calm a frightened child, heal a hospital ward's despair, keep a lantern lit in a fierce storm of grief. Her voice could move people. She had convinced herself it would be her ladder when all other stairs had been blocked. At night, when the keep went quiet and the guards' boots echoed like distant storms, she would sit by the narrow window and tell the stone itself a tale. She told it of a girl who tracked rain with bare feet, of a fox that taught a miller how to love again, of a boy who mended his father's laughter with string and patience. The stones listened. The wind listened. She thought once that such solitary telling would not be noticed. Cailorin noticed. He began appearing in the corridor just beyond the door, a silhouette against torchlight. He did not stand flinging judgment. He stood as one who had come to watch a rare weather pattern, fascinated not by the weather's destruction, but by its shape. "You tell stories," he said the first time he spoke close enough that she could see the tiny scar that tracked his jaw like a map. "Yes," she answered. The simple admission felt like a confession. "It is what I have." He sat on the bed's edge then, a gesture that collapsed the space between them, and the air changed. Lysara's palms were suddenly a foreign sensation, too warm, shaky in a way she did not like. "Tell me one," he requested, voice softer than any she'd heard from him in the public rooms, yet still threaded with the iron and something else she could not name. She chose a trivial one first, small as a pebble. A story about a woman who could weave the river's music into cloth. She watched him as she spoke. He watched her with an attention she had been denied all her life. It felt like a heat in winter, a rare comfort. Her words were plain and full of sensory detail. The river's wetness, the fabric's smell of algae and sunlight, the hushed laughter that came from a woman who finally understood her craft. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he sat for a long time thinking. When he did speak, his voice had lost some of its hardness. "Why do you tell these to stones instead of people?" he asked. "People tire of the small things," Lysara said. "They think only of wars and lineages and the ticking of advantage. Stories like mine are for hands that have been too long used to work and are weary of being useful." He considered that. Perhaps there is more usefulness in quietness than we acknowledged. The conversation threaded them together in a new pattern. Small confidences traded in the margin of a relationship defined by power. He fed her bread with honey on mornings that arrived like small miracles. He introduced her to a healer, an old woman named Cylindra with palms mapped by years, who allowed Lysara to watch as she tended to the wounded. The healer's hands were slow as a ritual, and when Lysara watched them, something inside her loosened, as if a bolt had been undone. "You have a gift," Cylindra told her one afternoon, when the sun warmed the courtyard and the scent of thyme rose from the central garden. Lysara remembered the way the healer handled a raw cheek with the reverence she would give to a relic. "What would you call it?" she asked, surprised that Cylindra saw the surface she tried to hide. "Empathy," Cylindra said plainly. "You step where others would step back. You speak truths that close the wound sharper than salve. That is a rare thing. It is not meet to win battles, no, but it is the kind of healing that returns a man to himself." Lysara thought of Cailerin then, sitting in shadows with a private hollow in his voice. She felt a small, almost painful tug. He had not told her his secret. He had not needed to. His isolation was a secret worn on his skin. She began to find traces of him outside the private rooms. A child's shirt mended with unexpected patience. A stallion coaxed from rage by the gentlest handling. A guard whose bones ached speaking softer when he spoke of home. The keep became a place where, under the surface of iron and custom, the rich earth of small acts accumulated. Rumors were the valley's other weather, and one storm gathered in the west. Lord Dralveth, Calorin's uncle by blood and malice, began to flex his governance like a sleeper waking from a dream. Dralveth had all the velvety cruelty of a man who believed in the older, harsher laws. He found the idea of a wolfless living inside the warden's keep intolerable. He saw Lysara as a stain on their honor, a possible leverage against Kylorin. If he saw a way to use her humiliation to his end, he would not hesitate. "You drew a dangerous thing into your house," Dralveth told Kylorin in his first public rebuke. The hall smelled of roasted meat and cheap wine. Kylorin did not rise to Dralveth's provocation. Instead, his expression was a closed shell. "You bring in the valueless and call it mercy. You make mockery of our laws." "Mercy has its uses," Kylorin replied. "She is not your concern." Dralveth's lip curled. "Everything in this valley is my concern, nephew. Especially what it means for succession. A warden who spoils his honor will be found wanting." Lysara had been in the amphitheater that night, assigned to distribute wines in the tiers, and she heard the conversation like a thunderclap. Her tasks went tremulous with each volley. The audience kept turning back to her to measure her reaction. She found herself looking at Kylorin as a man might look at a ship in storm, hoping the ropes would hold. Later, when the hall had emptied, she approached him while his hands were busy with maps and the faint stench of wax. The map's lines, river and road, felt to her like the skin of the world. "You do not answer him," she said, standing at the edge of the table. He closed his eyes for a breath and then opened them, and a half-smile curved at one corner of his mouth. "I answer as I need to," he replied. "Power needs only an efficient application." "Efficient," she repeated, tasting the word. "You mean ruthless." "Sometimes." He tapped a nail against the map as if to assert the precision of his words. "Sometimes you must be ruthless to be kind." "Ruthless to be kind is an interesting philosophy." She felt a spark of humor, too small to be dangerous, curl in her chest. "What would you do, wolfless, if Dralveth moved against you?" he asked. His eyes were no longer on the map but on her, and a fierce, protective angle edged his voice. For the first time she recognized not merely boredom or curiosity in him, but a depth of feeling that bent toward concern. She measured her answer. "I would tell a story that undo him," she said finally. "That is my talent." He laughed softly then, and the sound startled her. "A story," he repeated. "You think a story can undo a man like Dralveth?" "Acknowledgement does," she corrected. "You can unmake a man who thrives on shame by making him small and impotent in front of the people who give him his power." Kylorin regarded her with an expression that was not easily read. "You are bold for someone with no backing," he observed. "I have the truth," she said simply. "And sometimes truth is a weapon none of us value until it is pointed at our necks." Kylorin's jaw tightened. "Do you think to wield truth as a blade?" "I think to tell the truth until it pierces what's rotten. Yes." Her voice had steady conviction now. There had been too long living where truth was a currency no one accepted. She intended to test its sharpness. He was silent for a long time. Lysara felt the pull of something braided of danger and possibility. If he chose to protect her, he would cut himself across customs like a blade exposed. If he chose to follow the valley's expectations, she would become spectacle. There was no neutral middle ground. "I will not allow Dralveth to use you as leverage," Kylorin said finally, and there was steel to the words. "Not because of what you are, but because Dralveth is mine to prevent." She did not know whether to feel relief or the stronger tenderness that was like a new weather. It was the first time a man of his standing had framed her as something deserving defense rather than an inconvenience. The idea felt illegal and delicious. Days turned like pages. Bonds tightened not merely by law, but by the slow labor of acquaintance. Lysara found herself drawn to the parts of the keep where she might be unnoticed by honor and yet seen by the hearts that lay cautious in shadow. Caloran's vulnerability did not show in obvious afflictions. It was not a limp nor a stain of the bloodless eyes. It was subtler, an ache of isolation he wore like a cloak. He had tried to forge himself into the perfect warden, to be authoritative to the point of being unapproachable. The loneliness of that attempt had hollowed him. He would sometimes wake in the small hours, and Lysara, sitting by her window, could hear him pacing the corridor like a restless tide. One night she followed the sound without meaning to. He had not noticed. He never made an invitation. She traced the path through the keep that led to the old tower, where the air smelled of parchment and mistakes. She paused at the door and listened to his breath. Inside, he had a chest of books he seldom opened. He kept them because they were relics of a life he had hoped to claim. Histories, maps from other lands, star charts. One book lay open on a wooden table, pages thumbed by anxious hands. Lysara peered in and saw threaded handwriting that spoke of ports and climates in terms that made her think the world was larger than the valley's whipped edges. "You study the world," she said softly, not startling him but letting the sound settle behind him like a nightbird. He did not turn. "I study the ways of power," he answered. "You study stories. We both try to understand the world by other people's arrangements." "Are the world's arrangements kind?" she asked. He closed the book then and turned to look at her in the lantern light, and his face showed a fatigue that was older than he was. "Not always," he said, "but often the world is kinder than the men who pretended to rule it." She thought of her mother, and the bargain struck with shame. "You could change it," she said before she could stop herself. It was immodest, perhaps, but she had learned that concessions sometimes required risk. Caloran's expression shifted a fraction. "Change is expensive," he said, "and sometimes it requires exposing the wounds that people prefer hidden." She thought of Dralveth watching, waiting for the slip. She thought of Caloran's stubborn refusal to yield to villainy. An odd, daring plan took shape in her chest, a pattern like a web you felt before you saw. "What if you did not have to cut yourself to change it?" she asked. "What if you could be seen not as a monster to be placated, but as someone worthy of being known? Who would that change?" He was silent. "Who would that change first, you mean?" he corrected. She smiled then, a small, private thing. "Perhaps us both," she said. The valley moved like a beast that shivered at caution. Dralveth escalated. He began to sow small rumors among the lesser lords, mentions of Caloran's weakness, strange talk of a warden who sheltered a wolfless as if it were treason. He wrote letters dipped in insinuation and distributed them with the care of a spider's web. Caloran took one step others could not easily take. He called for a public council not to be held in the stuffy chamber, but in the open bowl of the valley itself, in the market where people came to trade eggs and gossip and a child's fever medicine. That decision shocked many, but his purpose was precise. He wanted the people to see him with Lysara at his side. She wore the plain dress she had been given, the same dress that people often used to denote poverty, and her hands were steady. They stood together beneath the open sky, where the air tasted like iron and dust. Dralveth stood across the square with a retinue of men who smiled with venom. The gamble unfurled. "You brought her here to parade her!" Dralveth shouted first, voice meant to thread shame through the crowd. "You embolden those without blood. You mock us with your charity, nephew." Lysara could feel the scrutiny like a physical pressure. Her breath came in shallow, precise pulls. She recalled every story she had ever told, and then all the words she had swallowed instead. Then she stepped forward. "You speak of mockery," she said, voice finding its way through the crowd. "Yet you stand protected by men who would fall without you. You call me valueless when I bear witness to the truth none of you speaks. You call me shame while you hoard your fear." Silence fell like a pressed hand. It was the kind of silence that allowed words room to live. Dralveth laughed, a small, brittle sound. "You presume to lecture me?" he said. "You are of no import. You would make a mockery of the laws." "You would make a mockery of honor," Lysara countered, finding a rhythm, a cadence. "Honor is not the weight you place on others, but the truth you keep when no one watches. If you can only call someone less because she lacks lineage or coin, then you have built your house on sand. I am not seeking to unmake your law. I am telling you this: a house of sand will not hold when the storm comes. It is better to learn how to build what lasts." Heads turned. Murmurs spread like a wave. People tasted the edges of her words and found something they wanted but had not known how to name. Cailarin had not interceded. He stood a little apart, his shadow falling across the crowd like an implacable presence. Yet when Lysara finished, when the last syllable trembled into the valley's ears, he stepped forward and put his hand on her shoulder. "She speaks the truth," he said, and the sound of his voice turned the air taut. "This woman is no enemy to the valley. If you seek to demonize or mock her, you will find your words small and yourself exposed to what we were never meant to accept." Dralveth's retinue bristled, and the murmur became a swell of dissent. The square tasted suddenly of charged metal. "You would defend this wolfless?" Dralveth snapped. "You would make a shield of her. If she is your shield, then you make yourself weak." Cailarin stepped fully into view. "And yet, I would rather be weak and honest than strong and rotten," he declared. "I would rather be judged by my choices than by the lines others drew before I took breath. If my defense of another is weakness to you, then judge me by that. But do not try to bind me with the chains of an old policy." The square erupted, not into violence, but into a storm of voices. Lysara felt a sensation like standing in the midst of rain after a long drought. People shifted. A few voices called for Dralveth to be quiet. Others chanted that change was dangerous. In the turbulence, something else happened. Faces she had never seen looked toward her with a small, bright interest. A woman who sold pottery placed a hand over her mouth as if to still sudden tears. A boy with a bandaged knee pushed his chin up with an expression she recognized. Hope. That night, Cailarin walked her to her little window and did not speak until they were inside. When he finally said something, it was not arrogance, but a bare, small admission. "You put yourself at risk today," he said. "I put myself where I could be seen," she corrected. "There is a difference," he said. "I know," she replied. "I have learned the valley hates what it cannot contain, but it also respects what the warden authorizes. Because you stood with me, the valley will think twice." He looked at her then with something like awe. "You wield words like others wield swords," he said. I had not known the power of story in such a guise. She looked at him, at the way the candlelight highlighted the planes of his face. She thought of the vulnerability he had chosen to show in that public gesture, the exposing of himself in a way that threatened his reputation. "You have vulnerabilities too," she murmured, and in that simple speech she named what had hovered like a question between them for weeks. Caloran's hand hovered near hers, almost an invitation. "I do," he said, "but perhaps less in the way you think." Lysara watched him go, and as the door shut, she felt the thud of her own heart like a drum. The valley had shifted, but not unmade its old habits. There would be reprisal. There would be barbed words, and perhaps worse. Yet in the wake of the day's storm, there had been a gift. The sight of a man of power willing publicly to stand unfazed by bloodlines and to defend the wolfless he had chosen. Drelveth's retaliation did not arrive as blunt force. He had learned patience as a craft. He began to manipulate marriages among lesser houses, whispered that Caloran's judgment was faltering. He spread stories that Lysara was secretly a spy, a poisoner, a witch who lured men to their doom with words. Most of these claims were laughable. They could not stand against the day's memory of Caloran's defense. But rumor's insidiousness was that it buried itself in the small seeds of everyday doubt. One evening, as rain made the keep smell of turned earth and the fires burned pungent and close, Lysara found her door barred. A scrap of parchment lay beneath it, black ink sharp as an accusation. "We will expose you." She read the words twice before the stomach tightness became a physical presence. They had been the valley's currency for a long time, threats that were designed to coerce and to isolate. She pressed the scrap to her chest as if it were as heavy as a chain. At dinner, Caloran watched her. He saw what she held but did not touch it. Instead, he sat across the table, his tone casual as stone. "Drelveth is sharpening his teeth." "You are not afraid," she said, choosing the words like the stones of a bridge. "I am always afraid," he answered. "Fear is not the absence of power. It is the presence of responsibility." She wanted to meet that with the truth she had worn like a banner. "I am not afraid either." He smiled at that, a rare curve that did not reach his eyes with playful intent but with a genuine softness. "You have become dangerous," he said. "Dangerous in a good way?" she asked. "In the way truth is," he said. "It makes you unpredictable to those who depend on steady lies." The scrap of paper waited like a small prophecy. Lysara folded it and slipped it into a hidden seam of her dress. She did not want the paper to be a lodestone for worry. She had stories to tell. Threats could be a chorus to the next tale, not the end of the story. After the meal, she walked the corridor to the old tower alone. The rain had washed the keep into a smell of sodden stone and lavender. The tower's ladder creaked beneath her bare feet. Inside, by the stash of old books Kaloran kept closed, she took down a volume of folk tales and began to read. The world of the story offered her the same thing it always had. Witnesses who lived beyond immediate prejudice and a logic that made sense in the bones. She read of a queen who had once been a commoner and who, by kindness, healed the land's dull rages. She read of a soldier who had given away his medals and found himself royal in ways that mattered more. These were not fanciful illusions so much as parables that reflected the possible in a world carved by intention. When she heard him enter, he did not speak. He settled into a shadow and listened. She did not stop. Instead, she let the cadence of the plot flow. Kyloran's fingers twined around the book at the point where she had left off, and when she glanced at him, he was close enough that she saw the faint tremor in his left hand he would rarely display. "Do people change?" he asked finally, not the rhetorical kind, but a real question. "They can," she answered. "Not all do, but many more would if there were a reason to." He turned the pages slowly, as if timing were important. What reason could there be besides fear? "A sense of belonging makes people braver," she said. "There are forces stronger than fear. Love, trust. We do not often allow ourselves the chance to know them." He closed the book then, marking their place, and the gesture felt like a vow. "Show me," he said. Lysara looked at him and felt an answer rising like dawn. "Then stay," she told him simply. "Stay in the market when I speak. Sit beside the ones who repair roofs. Let them see you. Let them know that the warden is a man who chooses those he will protect." Kyloran nodded slowly, like a man who had been given an order and had decided to make it his own. "Very well," he said. "We will go to the market. We will see what true belonging can do." They would go together in the morning. They would walk among ordinary lives and see the small ways in which courage grew like moss in the cracks of pavement. But for now, the rain sang on the slate roof, and inside the keep, two people who had started as transaction sat in the quiet and read old stories aloud as if to stitch themselves into the valley's future. The market was a kaleidoscope of noise and smell, pickled cabbage fumes, tang of fresh-baked bread, horses shifting with the cackling of birds, children's cries that were more blunt than poetry, but entirely alive. Kyloran moved through it with purposeful ease, but when he stepped into the crowded space, he seemed to shrink into familiarity, taking up a human scale rather than the godlike one everyone projected onto him. To see him there with Lysara was to witness the unlikely. The high warden buying a loaf and laughing at a joke about whether not his own. The powerful man lowering to the scale of ordinary living so that it might be known he counted theirs as his concern. Lysara told a story under a cloth awning. She spoke about a girl who made lanterns from old tin and tallow, and then taught an old widow to read so that the widow could journal the recipes she had always carried in her head. People leaned closer, and while they listened, they ate torn pieces of bread, exchanged coins, and traded the usual barbs that passed as daily diplomacy. The story seeped into them like oil melts into a cloth. Dralveth's men watched from the edges, like flies waiting for rot. They took pictures in their eyes and stored them for later sharpness. But the people took the seed of Lysara's narrative and planted it in the open soil of their immediate lives. A carpenter who had been too proud to fix another man's fence took in a neighbor's child for the afternoon. A merchant who had been cold to beggars began leaving a coin for the boy who mended shoes. If Dralveth had expected the crowd to echo his voice and fall into the tidy order of old prejudice, he misjudged. The valley liked its stability, but loved its stories more. If someone of real standing told them a new pattern, they would at least hum to the new tune. Still, Dralveth did not concede. That night he sent a man with a message that stung with cunning. It was not a threat of violence, but a note of offered compromise, a suggestion that Lysara be taken away to a convent far to the south in exchange for Caelorin's tacit demise. Caelorin read the letter as though reading a wound. "He seeks to remove the problem," he said slowly, "to hide the thing he cannot change." Lysara felt a flare of sorrow at that. Sorrow for him who had more targets than she did, and sorrow for what it meant to be pawns in men's designs. "Then let him see the fruit of his cruelty," she said, and the words carried a cunning. He looked at her, eyes narrowed. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Invite him to the next public work," she said. "Let him see how the valley grows when he takes part instead of just speaking from the sidelines." Caelorin considered that. "That would require real humility," he observed. "Humility suits some as well as armor suits others," she said. "Ask him to help build the new bridge. Let him lay stones beside his men. Leave him with no place to preen, only labor." He studied her then, as if measuring whether she plotted for his amusement or for his good. "You scheme dangerously," he said at last. "I scheme in a way that might make him human again," she replied. "Or at least it will make his pride ache in public instead of with private malice." He smiled then, an easy thing now, not guarded. "Very well," he said. "We will build a bridge." The following weeks became a rhythm of labor and story. The keep's men and the valley's folk worked together under Caelorin's orders with the stubborn precision of those who had learned to maintain the line between survival and ruin. Dralveth performed his part in the initial hours as requested, but the work of stone and mortar was not something easily faked. Muscles unfamiliar with the honest threshold of labor betrayed him. His hands bled in places his retinue did not expect to look. The crowd watched. People saw him as a man who had to decide whether to claim the labor or to retreat into old, safer judgments. Lysara told tales between tasks. She wandered the worksite like a subtle enchantress, offering stories of workers who had found their place and having them retold by men who rarely spoke past scowls. The language of uplifting narrative moved like heat in the cold air of prejudice and change. Dralveth's face changed in small human ways as the days pressed on. He furrowed more, straightened less, and sometimes paused, watching someone lift a stone with a purity of sweat he had not known how to value. Watching small things is itself a way to be altered. The bridge took shape under hands that had once belonged to enemies. Caelorin's men, Dralveth's men, Kelthor the potter, a woman with a basket of herbs. When the arch was nearly complete, the valley turned out to celebrate in small ways. On that evening, Dralveth came to Caelorin's side. He did not speak at first, merely standing near the arch with the rest. When he finally did speak, it was to Lysara. "You have made a challenge of me," he said, and it was not entirely a threat now. There was a grudging respect beneath the barbs. "You have made me feel foolish in public." "Then perhaps you might not feel so foolish in private when you look back on what you built," she replied. He grunted and raised a flagon as if to toast. "To the bridge," he said. Caelarine replied to that with a small, quiet smile and lifted his own flagon. The valley around them cheered at a small, practical victory. The arch stood like an answer. It connected two parts of a place that had grown used to separation, and the act of crossing it would become, in years to come, part of the story that defined who they were. Dralveth's victory in public was a small thing. His private resentment remained. But bridges had a way of doing what bridges do. They made travel possible. They offered paths for people who would not otherwise meet. Over time, the bridge would carry more than carts and livestock. It would carry gossip and births, grief and weddings, the dull rhythms of life that eventually change the face of a place. In the wake of the bridge's completion, a quieter war continued to boil. Political intrigue rarely admitted defeat. Dralveth began focusing on Caeloren's allies, probing for a weakness to exploit. That didn't mean Lysara was safe. A hole still existed in their peace. A wound Dralveth had both ambition and malice to exploit. One night, an assassin attempted to take Caeloren in the hallways. The strike was sudden and terrible. A hidden blade, a cry, the sound of wood and breath broken. Lysara was close enough to hear it. She ran when she recognized the motion. People collided in grunts and the scream of surprise. The assassin's aim had been true. A poisoned blade angled toward the warden's heart, but the man fell instead beneath the pressure of many hands. Caeloren lay on the stone, and the world narrowed to the metallic smell of blood and the electric flare of panic. The blade had done more than cut skin. A dark bloom of poison spread like ink in linen. No healer present recognized its signature. Cylindra, who had seen the keep's worst injuries, looked as if the color had leaked out of her. Lysara grabbed his hand then, a rash impulse in the face of everything, and the contact felt like an electric bolt. For the first time since he had taken her into his keep, something passed from her into him, and it was not a word but a ripple of grounded focus. She felt his breath labored, each one a mountain's labor. Blood slicked the stone. "You cannot go," she said, though whether she spoke to him or to the room she could not tell. Her palms pressed to the wound, and instinct did what discipline could not. Her fingers smelled of coal and lavender, and the faint metallic tang of the keep. She shut her eyes and told him a story in the rhythm that had always calmed the worst beasts inside people she loved. A story about a man who gave away his crown to save a child. She ran the edges of the tale like a bandage, shaping words to hold a person together. Cylindra lashed herbs and called in aid. The guards winged out to find evidence of the assassin. The room circled around them like sea. Lysara's words were not enough for the poison. Everyone knew that. The poison would take him unless they found the cure. But there was another quality in her telling. It steadied Caeloren's breathing, slowed the panic in his heart, and made his mind present. Presence had healing power of its own. In a moment of rare clarity, Caeloren opened his eyes and looked at her. The world had narrowed to two faces, the man who had raised him and the woman who told stories as if they could fight. "If I die," he rasped, voice flat as a bell struck, "see that they know I was not cowed." Lysara laughed then, a sound sharp and fierce. "You do not get to make speeches and then die," she snapped. "You are stubborn and vexing, but you are not allowed to depart until the story is finished." His fingers tightened around hers, a promise pressed into flesh. "Then finish it," he said. The days that followed were a blur of ache and the grind of practical rescue. Poison moved like a slow tide, and they had to learn its edges. Kaloran's wound festered under the watch of the healers. Cylindra and Lysara worked in tandem, mixing poultices and chanting incantations older than the keep. They experimented. Salves, poultices, herbs meant to burn out infection, and stories that warmed the mind from within. Lysara discovered, gradually and with a dawning sense of the impossible, that her stories did more than console. They changed the physiology of the wounded in the keep. When she told a tale centered on a memory of childhood safety, the victims' cortisol levels seemed to drop, their muscles unknotted. When she told a story about the reclaiming of a lost thing, wounds closed with a speed that made Cylindra's eyes widen. No one could explain it, and the learned men who measured such things insisted on calling it psychosomatic. Yet people lived and healed in ways that made the concept of psychosomatic seem suddenly grander. Caelarine responded in a way no one had predicted. He grew quieter in his long hours of wakefulness, not from pain, but from a kind of honest vulnerability that opened like a bruise to the sun. He began to tell Lysara things that he had never told any other soul. Small confessions that were odd as seeds and as precious. He told her about his father, the warden before him, who had taught him to be fearsome because fear was efficient. He told her of a childhood where a boy crawled under a table and pretended to be a wolf because the wolves were less frightening than the men who sat at the table. "You have been lonely in a way most people mistake for strength," she said one night when his breathing was a little more even. She felt the pulse confusion. The man she saw in the ballroom's shadows was a public mask. The person beside her was a man carrying a wound too big for one to bear alone. He looked at her then with eyes that had truth and something like plead. "If you leave," he said, "and I remain wounded, will you come back to tell me the rest of the story?" "I will," she whispered. "I will tell it until you are well." He stayed. She told, and the pattern set itself like new maps of the world. But the outside world did not care for their quiet rituals. Drulveth's spite had not withered. If anything, it grew sharper, twisting into strategies more deadly than letters and rumors. He began to move with subtler claws, seeking to bend the valley's alliances through favors and debts. One night, Drulveth sent emissaries to several lesser lords with a ledger of bribes. For a price, a favor, a future claim, he promised advancement. The valley's old habits made such offers tempting. Lysara heard of this in the hush after dusk and made a decision that was reckless and necessary. She would go to the lords herself and tell her story. She rode out at dawn, the mist clinging like a thin veil to the road. The keep fell away behind her, a dark eyebrow on the horizon. Caelarine had placed a small pack in her hands and told her to be careful, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "Do not make it a battle," he cautioned. "Make it a listening." "Listening is my trade," she said, trying for lightness. I have been paid in food and shelter for it already." He gave a slow nod and did not say more. Standing at the edge of the keep, she felt the valley like a living thing, a beast with habits, history, and a hunger for stories that reinforced its identity. She was going to feed it a story of a different kind. Her first stop was a small manor whose lord was known to take bribes like comfort. She entered the courtyard with the gait she had practiced, an openness to make the other feel unsafe if they had reason to be. The lord greeted her with tested civility and motioned to chairs near the hearth. The room smelled of roasted meat and the sharp perfume of authority. "You are the warden's entertainment?" he asked with a sneer. "I am a woman who tells what others have forgotten," she replied, and set her voice like a net. "I tell the stories of those you have overlooked." "A story won't sway me," he scoffed. Lysara settled and began. She told of a household much like his own, a man who hoarded favors, who spoke of security, and held the purse strings like a god. She painted a picture of the consequences of a man who chose his advantage above the good of his people. A house with boarded windows and a child's laughter absent because of a withheld coin. At the story's heart, she traced a single image, an image mirrored in the Lord's own face, if he could be honest. She did not point fingers. She wove a fate that followed poor choices to their inevitable end. The Lord scowled, then frowned, then, more quietly than she expected, asked, "Why tell me this, wolfless?" "Because you love your house and your name," she said. "Because you are afraid of what your family will think if you have no legacy but fear." But what is a legacy of fear if there is no one left to carry it with joy? I ask you, stand with the warden. Invest in a future where bridges are built and children have food. Bribes will never buy you a clean conscience. They will only buy you a silent house. The Lord stared at the hearth, into his own reflection in the smoked glass. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, he nodded. It was not a grand conversion, but it was a seed. He promised a small donation to the bridge's maintenance fund and decreased his willingness to accept Dralveth's offers. One by one, she moved through houses, telling the same pattern in different inflections, stories tailored to the listener's weaknesses and strengths. Some resisted, many listened. A few changed enough to be a problem for Dralveth's ledger. When she returned to the keep, the map of alliances felt newly revised. Her absence had been a test for them both. Caeloren paced the inner rooms and censored his own fretfulness into functionality. He gave orders and checked that none had been subverted. Yet whenever the propriety of governance permitted a glance outside work, he looked for the slim figure that told stories in the market and in the halls. She returned with news of small victories and salt on her boots. Dralveth had been quiet for the first time in weeks, more than quiet. He had moved his schemes into darker rooms. The valley's shift made his own long scowl deeper. "Your journeys make trouble for some men," Caeloren said, examining a ledger she'd brought him. The burn of candlelight made her cheeks glow like soft heat. "I hoped it would," she said simply. "Truth is not always comfortable." "You keep risking yourself," he observed. "Who else will do it?" she asked. "If the warden refuses to speak in the open, someone must. And if the warden must choose his words, then he must have someone who can soften his edge and shape the valley's ears to listen. He seemed to weigh that. "You teach me diplomacy," he said, half in jest. "You teach yourself to be seen," she corrected. The smile that followed was easier. They had crossed a threshold. Neither of them had acknowledged love in the formal way that would matter in the valley, but the current of feeling ran deep. It had become the undertow that drew them toward shared decisions. But Dralveth did not forget nor forgive. When he saw his ledger lose its brightness, he struck a darker blow. He accused Lysara publicly of collusion with common thieves who had recently looted a convoy. The accusation spread like oil. The valley's old habits die slowly. Rumor had long legs. Lysara had been awake when the accusation landed. She had been thinking of the iron law that men like Dralveth used like knives. She could not allow herself the luxury of fear. Fear had eaten her childhood. Instead, she took Kaloran's hand and told him plainly that she would face the accusation. "You will not face it alone," he said. "I know," she replied. They set a hearing in the market, not the closed council rooms. The valley deserved witnesses. Lysara stood and told the story of what had happened to the convoy. A chance theft, opportunism, men with empty stomachs given a chance. She did not deny the theft, but she pointed to how the men who had stolen were those who could not see a future. She laid blame at the feet of a broken system, not at Dralveth's men specifically. Dralveth bellowed, then tried to appeal to fear. He painted Lysara as a conspirator who would use stories to lull the valley into accepting subversion. But Kaloran rose and argued for her bravery and her truth. In the end, the valley listened. It did not rule Lysara innocent because many of its members were suspicious by habit, but it did find her not guilty of the charges Dralveth laid, and in a small vote, the crowd agreed she would continue to live in the keep under Kaloran's protection. Dralveth's face was a portrait of defeat. He gathered his men and withdrew, not vanquished, but not triumphant either. The valley, it turned out, was not monolithic. It could be persuaded by daily kindness and by the integrity of a man who would stand in public for what he valued. That night, in the privacy of the library, Kaloran unrolled an old map and traced the routes that linked the valley to the outside world. "There are threats we cannot yet see," he said. "Dralveth will not go quietly." "No," Lysara agreed. "Men who prosper from division keep dividing. But there is a chance to change a small thing," he added, "to do something that will make a claim on our future." "Change one policy," she guessed. "Yes," he said, "to make kindness a law as binding as blood." His eyebrows knit, and there was a soft lucidity in his voice. "To enshrine that those who shelter the weak are rewarded and that exploitation is punished." Lysara felt the possibility like the first warm breath of spring. "We could start with the bridge fund," she suggested. "Make a charter that mandates maintenance by all hands. Make it a seat in the council for someone chosen by the people, instead of by lineage." "That would make enemies," he warned. "It would make allies too," she insisted. "And some enemies are worth the trouble. We have already shown the valley's temper. This might solidify a new law." He looked at her and saw the fierce tenderness in the way she spoke. For the first time, not only did he consider a law, but he considered a life that included her in it. The idea began to form, not as a mere political maneuver, but as a true possibility of partnership. "Will you stand beside me?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. It was a small answer and a vast one. They had traversed from strangers to an odd sort of alliance to the cusp of something that might be called companionship. He reached for her hand again. The touch was casual but full of meaning. Outside, the valley breathed in its sleep. When the charter was presented, Dralveth's men protested in the council. He rallied against Kylorin with all the old songs of lineage. "You cannot change what has always been," he said, history's voice used as a cudgel. "You threaten the order of our houses." Kylorin replied with calm that had teeth. He presented a case not of rhetoric, but of evidence. Repairs to roads, fewer children hungry, more trade because people trusted the bridge. He offered witnesses, and a potter whose shop had prospered because of increased traffic described it in terms that hurt Dralveth. Trade, bread, and a child's ability to remain in school because there was money for candle wax. The tide of practical necessity slowly pushed the old rhetoric to the side. In the end, the charter passed, though not unanimously. It was a start. The valley had chosen a new edge. Lysara watched as parchment became law and felt the shape of an unusual future solidify like light through glass. Dralveth withdrew into dark rooms again, quietly seeding future descent. But the valley had a new law and a new way of meeting the future. A year passed in the valley, like a story told across winter and spring. Kylorin's rule steadied. The charter held. The bridge, long a symbol of new passage, required maintenance, but was never a point of division again. The keep where Lysara had been bought, or rather brought, changed into a place where less fear lived and more choices blossomed. In the quiet evenings, Lysara would sit by the narrow window and tell stories of distant places she had never seen, and people would come to hear. The keep's corridors, once full of the echoing dominion of a solitary man, now carried laughter, the sound of children learning to build small lamps in the courtyard, and murmurs of counsel that felt less like mandate and more like conversation. Kylorin moved through the valley with the deliberate patience of a man who had learned to leave his guard lowered just enough for trust to enter. He had not abandoned caution. He had only redistributed it to the people who had proved themselves. The old warden's armor did not fall away entirely, but it acquired edges softened by the practice of mercy. Lysara found herself changed in ways she had not foreseen. She could sense how the valley measured her now, not with the old derision, but with a cautious respect. Children who once called her wolfless now called her by name, and elders nodded when she passed. She had not become unquestioned or unchallenged. That would be a fantasy. She had become a person of consequence, not because of lineage, but because her story had been persuasive enough to rewrite others. Kylorin, once a man who protected from a high seat, had become a protector who chose personally to stand between the valley and its worst habits. The vulnerability he carried, his habitual solitariness, and the scars that ran deeper than they should have, had eased because he had someone who could accept him without making him smaller for it. He had someone who stood for him in the market and who could tell the valley why a man might choose differently. In that slow translation, something like love had been born. They had not yet articulated the shape of that love. There had been small moments, a hand resting a commodity of warmth for a little longer than politeness required, a private dinner where they discussed not governance but childhood toys, a day where Kalerine had stopped the council and introduced a child who had mended the bridge's railing with a public praise that made the child's cheeks flush. But they had not had the ritual, the word, the binding that certain seasons demanded. It would come. They had weathered attempts at violence, a poisoned blade, the slow of whispered malice. They had made law and built bridges. The valley no longer called Lysara, a shame to be hidden. People looked to her as a woman who had helped the valley see itself anew. 1 year later, the valley had settled into a quieter, better rhythm. The bridge stood strong, and children ran across it with flags. The keep had softened, its banners flown not as displays of impenetrable power, but as marks of duty. Lisa Rice and Kalerine had taken a seat in the council that was no mere token. Lysara's script appeared on parchments that once bore only names of blood. Her voice was now part of their lawmaking. They had married in a ceremony that blended rituals of lineage and of chosen kin. The hall had been full not only of nobles, but of potters and bridge menders, of people who had once been divided by dirt and now tasted the same bread. In the crowd, a trio of children under the age of 5 ran, their laughter like bells. The oldest, a daughter with hair like the dusk, tugged on Lysara's sleeve and asked when she would tell another story. Lysara laughed and knelt to the child. She took the girl's face in her hands and planted a kiss on her brow, a mark given not by blood but by choice. Kalerine stood behind them, his hand on Lysara's shoulder. He had scars that still mapped his jaw, but his eyes were softer. Where once he had stood wrapped in armor of accusation and fear, he now walked through the valley with a partner who had no pedigree, but an abundance of courage. They had a child, a small son, whose first cry announced his place, not in the lineage of a warden, but in the lineage of a new way. He carried a mark on his wrist now that people whispered about, the sign of a union between different kinds of power, the sturdy line of leadership, and the strange magic of a storyteller's heart. The valley was not perfect. There remained those who opposed the changes, including Dralveth, who had retreated into bitter corners, licking wounds. But the majority, swayed by practical kindness and daily evidence of mutual care, moved towards something better. Where old prejudices had once determined the lifespan of a family, now there existed a space where choice and honesty counted. Kalerine and Lysara ruled with a blend of measured judgment and mercy. He made decisions with the competence of a man who knew battle. She tempered those decisions with humanity, the sort that knew the names of grieving mothers. Under their watch, the valley's children had less time hungry and more time to learn. Trade increased, and festivals took on a gentler tone, celebrating not triumphs of conquest, but the small victories of daily life. At night, after the council had rested and the lamps were doused, Lysara and Kalerine sat by the fire with their child sleeping in a room nearby. He would sometimes take her hand and say, "You were the weapon I did not know I needed," and she would smile and reply, "And you were my fortress." They had remade each other, neither sacrificing their cores nor erasing their pasts. Instead, they braided them. The warden, who had been famed for being an immovable monolith, had learned how to be present, and the wolfless, who had started life with little claim, had learned how to shape power into story. That year had not just been about survival. It had been about transformation. The valley, witness to both cruelty and mercy, had begun to choose differently. It had witnessed a woman once discarded become a leader whose voice held weight. It had watched a man of power choose humility, and those small acts, told and retold, embodied in law, solidified in the daily work of living, shifted an entire community's habits. At the end of the year, under a sky stitched with cold and clear stars, Lysara stood on the bridge and watched her son push a small toy boat into the water. The toy bobbed and caught, riding the current with the ease of someone who knew the route already. She felt Caelorn's hand find hers and squeeze. "We made a good story," he said. She rested her head against his shoulder and watched the toy sail away. "We keep telling it," she replied, and in her voice there was the promise of more stories to come, stories that would hold the valley together with the quiet power of truth. They had moved from a beginning threaded with humiliation and helplessness to a life that was full of responsibility, love, and new laws. They had persevered not because violence had stopped, but because the way they met each day's small cruelty changed. That, more than any battle won, was their triumph. A valley learning, slowly and clumsily, to choose compassion as its own form of power.